My next guest is Congressman Brad Wenstrup from Ohio. He's been a physician for more than 30 years, and he's co-chair of the GOP Doctors Caucus. I spoke with him a short while ago. Here's my conversation with Brad Wenstrup.
Congressman Wenstrup, thank you so much for joining us. I think part of our job today is to focus in on how the healthcare ecosystem that we have, including the rare disease community, 1 in 10 Americans, suffering with various ailments that are challenging these times, but COVID has made everything worse. But I know that you kind of look at the broad side of what's happened to this ecosystem. And I'm wondering what you're most worried about at this moment right now about delivering affordable, dependable health to Americans, and what's on Brad Wenstrup's radar screen.
Well, there's a lot going on in that arena, obviously. And as a physician, this is really important to me. And I always want to focus on being patient-centered, and that we're looking at, how patients are affected with decisions that we make in Washington or whatever the case may be. I think all those are important. You mentioned rare diseases, and I kind of want to look at all diseases, but rare diseases are a little bit more challenging sometimes, because the numbers aren't there. There are not as many people being affected by this. You saw what happened with the pandemic, and boom, we come together on Operation Warp Speed and we develop a vaccine, right? So something that's smaller in nature, not seen as much, sometimes gets left aside. But I think the voices of people with rare diseases are being heard a little bit more today. And we want to focus on cures or increasing quality of life for patients. How you maintain someone. I often use the term, Steve, where I say, we focus on lifespan, and outside of overdoses and suicides, we really do pretty well at keeping people alive. But let's focus on health span. How do we keep people healthier longer? Even if you have a chronic illness, how can we keep you healthier longer to where you can enjoy your family and go to work and do things like that? And then when it comes to cost, that's really where a lot of the savings is. The healthier you can keep people, the better off we are. So we should be looking at things in terms on the government side of dynamic scoring. And I like to use the example of the cure for hepatitis C. Well, without that cure, you're getting a lot of treatments, hospitalizations, eventually a transplant. A cure may cost a little bit more and cost something up front, but the savings is huge on the other end. So we've got to have our mindset around that and see the big picture. So
let me just interrupt there, because I think it's such an important point, but I want our audience to understand what you mean by dynamic scoring. And what I think you mean is that we are able to, from a budgetary perspective, look at those savings as something that helps offset the cost of investment. Do I have it right?
You got it right. I mean, so if you cure something that normally may cost $250,000 a year in hospitalizations, et cetera, but you can cure it for $8,000. Yeah, that $8,000 looks like an expensive treatment, but what did you save on the other end? And that's the same with not necessarily just with cures, but how do we keep people living at least a healthier lifestyle? Even if they have a chronic disease like diabetes, keep it under control. You're less likely to develop a lot of the side effects of that, like neuropathy, et cetera. So how do we maintain? And a lot of that is new drugs, new treatments, new innovations. So we don't want to do things from the government side that deter innovation. But what if you had payment from, say, government programs where you say, well, if it actually works, we'll pay you for it. Okay, for that particular drug. So then there's a lot of onus there, but on the manufacturers, et cetera, but you want to get to something that's actually giving a benefit that's good for everybody. So we also, we have the Rural and Underserved Healthcare Task Force out of Ways and Means Committee that is bipartisan. Now you're getting into access to care and things like that, right? So it's affordability is part of it, but a lot of times, you could have Medicaid, Medicare, you've got an affordable plan for you. Medicaid, no cost, but you can't get to a doctor. So we're engaging with things like telehealth. And, one of the things we learned, Steve, from the pandemic is you can't just focus on one thing. And that's a problem as a nation. And I kept saying, America needs to hear from the doctors that are treating COVID patients, but also need to be hearing from the doctors that are hearing from their patients and dealing with the depression and the isolation and the suicides and the domestic violence. And then, to me, just as important, the missed diagnosis. In other words, not a misdiagnosis, not an incorrect diagnosis.
Right.
It was never made because we're telling people, don't go to the hospital. You got to look beyond just this virus for the betterment of the country and its health.
Well, you raise a really, really important point, which is about that physical dimension of just seeing people and doing things. And you and I have talked about it before, about elective surgeries, key ones being put off during COVID. Well, another part of it on the research side, because I am interested in how, I used to be interested in how a bill becomes a law. And now I'm interested in how, a drug becomes a drug, or how you get it out there, particularly in this area where you've got a lot of rare disease need. But the economics are complicated and the timing is complicated. And guess what? Clinical trials are complicated if you had test sites shut down. You had people that couldn't go so which telehealth kind of rose in response. But it's been an interesting thing during this, period of time where lots of the research in the rare disease area has been, I would say, to put it mildly, met a lot of speed bumps. And I think, the view of the industry is that the FDA has tried in many ways to meet it. But it raises something I had never heard of, which is the exclusivity clock, whether or not we need to give, we need to understand, it's not a budget issue. It's just whether, given this time that the research process, whether we need to begin looking at how much exclusivity they get for the investment they're making during a time period when they couldn't function normally. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And, there's just a lot of things involved, too, with innovation. If you talk to anybody who gets a drug to market that actually is working, they can tell you what their portfolio looked like when they started and how many things that they had out there that failed and how much was invested in that. So a lot goes into getting a drug to market, and usually it's a success at the end of many failures. What was interesting, like Operation Warp Speed, when it came to the trials, we opened it up. The trials were taking place all across America. And so you were not just site specific. And so that was very helpful for us to try and figure out if the vaccine was working. So there's many things out there that we can do, that we should continue to do. We have the orphan drug tax credit. I think that's important because when you come up with this, unique drug for a unique illness, we got to give you a break because you know what, you had to invest a lot, and it's not like your other drugs that you're then going to go out and sell to hundreds of thousands of people across the world necessarily. You're in a very small market, but it's very important because, as patients, when we want to keep our eyes on patients and what they're doing and what they're feeling, it may be a rare disease, but when you have it, it's 100%.
Well, look, one of the areas I'm very thankful to you personally for is, you as co-chair of the Doctors Caucus, and because you kind of like some of the stuff I do, have opened the door to a lot of other members of Congress that are part of the Doctors Caucus. So I have talked to a great number of people because you've helped me reach Democrats and Republicans and talk about it. You've launched lots of bipartisan efforts on everything from surprise billing, deals in hospitals, et cetera. But I have talked to people on both sides of the aisle right now and say something like surprise billing, and again, getting back to the patient, what they're experiencing. And you have some concerns about how the Biden administration is ignoring all of that. So what's the terrain right now between the White House and Congress, bipartisan Congress, in the health legislation space?
Well, if you use surprise billing as an example, we wrote a law in a bipartisan fashion with support of every healthcare provider in the House of Representatives and Senate on bipartisan means, Republicans and Democrats. We wrote it in such a way that we had a position where we wanted to take the patient out of this surprise bill. You go to the hospital, you're treated, emergency appendectomy, whatever the case may be. Guess what? The surgeon on call isn't in your network. We take you out of that equation. Let this be between the surgeon or the hospital and the insurance company. So we set up an arbitration method that we thought was fair, and that's the one that passed. The process that was rejected was then put in place by the White House, and when they went to their rule.
Say that again. So the process that you folks voted against actually became kind of became the norm because the White House didn't do what the law says. Is that right?
That is correct. And we made it very clear to the White House before they went into their rulemaking what our bill says. So it wasn't like they just misinterpreted the intent. They deliberately changed the law as written because what they put in place is what we rejected in the House and Senate. So this is very disturbing on that front. But I will tell you on other areas, we sit down in bipartisan fashion, speak with the Surgeon General, concerns that we have, healthcare provider burnout, all of these types of things that are important, because if you don't have providers, you don't have care. And that's an important thing that we need to continue to address. And these are things that we do in a bipartisan fashion. And to that point, Steve, if you look at the end of the last term, we put in 1,000 new residency programs. What most people in America don't know is, one, we aren't graduating enough physicians, and two, they don't all have residency programs. So now you've got $200,000 in debt and no residency program to go to. I don't know what you do with that degree necessarily without that specific additional training. So we're trying to address those issues. We haven't had to put one of those bipartisan issues per se like that in front of the White House, but I hope we get the opportunity to, because there are many areas of concern on both sides of the aisle of things we can address, like training more physicians.
Let me ask you this last question, and I don't know how to get it just right, folks, but it occurs to me, as I've kind of have dived into this subject on rare diseases, that those Americans, those people around the world, those Americans who are suffering it, are often in very small communities. And they could be stigmatized. They could be a very lonely experience. We're talking at the federal level and orphan drug law and all this stuff. It just kind of, it reminds me of our discussion together about, folks that served in Iraq, served in Afghanistan, came back, mental health challenges. There's a kind of mental health dimension as well to this, is you have a lot of people that are lonely. And I just like to talk to Brad Wenstrup, the doctor, not Brad Wenstrup, the congressman. What is your advice to people who are suffering from this? Because it can be a long and lonely and complicated road to getting help and support when you're one of a very few people in a community.
Well, that's a good point. And so, we want to expand things like telehealth and remove barriers, whether it's transportation or whatever, to get to the right type of provider that can actually take care of your condition or do the best that they can. On our front, we do want to expedite. We pass bills like right to try new drugs and things like that aren't necessarily approved yet, but we really, that's a little bit complicated on the paperwork end, the administrative end, unfortunately. We can clean that up, but also, we want to let people know we are looking into, and if there are some opportunities or hope on the horizon, that we can get them to you. ALS is probably a good example, and I don't think ALS is even as rare as some of the others that are out there, but ALS, you have patients that are they're sitting in their home and they're watching themselves slowly die. And there may be some drug out there that they're reading about, and there are some. And like, why can't I get that? Why can't I get that? That's on our end to try and expedite that type of a process. But we want them to have hope and have someone to talk to, and not feel like the old school leper, right? That you are cast aside. That's not what we want for anybody. So we're trying to be as patient-centric as we can and try and solve some problems, whether it's bureaucratic or innovation and research, and expedite these types of things that can help the health of all Americans and all people around the world.
Well, I just want to tell our audience, whenever I call Congressman Brad Wenstrup and say, let's have a smart conversation on any policy issue, not just healthcare, you always say yes. And we really have a good time together learning from me. We learned from you, and we're very grateful. So Congressman Brad Wenstrup, Republican from Ohio, former doctor, served this nation abroad in the Iraq War. And I just want to say thank you so much for joining us, co-chair of the Doctors Caucus. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Appreciate the opportunity.
That brings us to the end of our program today. A very big thank you to Harmony Biosciences for its support of these conversations, and to all of you attendees for joining us. For those of you who may have missed any of the conversations, video from the event will be up on our website shortly. I'm Steve Clemons. Be well.